On a Chinese screen, Somerset Maugham, Part 5. 31. The stripling. He walked along the causeway with an easy, confident stride. He was 17, tall and slim, with a smooth and yellow skin that had never known a razor. His eyes, but slightly aslant, were large and open, and his full red lips were tremulous with a smile. The happy audacity of youth was in his bearing. His little round cap was set jauntily on his head, his black gown was girt about his loins, and his trousers, as a rule gartered at the ankle, were turned up to the knees. He went barefoot, but for thin straw sandals, and his feet were small and shapely. He had walked since early morning along the paved causeway that wound its sinuous path up the hills and down into the valleys with their innumerable paddy fields, past burial grounds with their serried dead, through busy villages where maybe his eyes rested approvingly for a moment on some pretty girl in her blue smock and her short blue trousers sitting in an open doorway, but I think his glance claimed admiration rather than gave it. And now he was nearing the end of his journey and the city whither he was bound seeking his fortune. It stood in the midst of a fertile plain surrounded by a crenellated wall, and when he saw it, he stepped forward with resolution. He threw back his head boldly. He was proud of his strength. All his worldly goods were wrapped up in a parcel of blue cotton, which he carried over his shoulder. Now Dick Whittington, setting out to win fame and fortune, had a cat for his companion, but the Chinese carried with him a round cage with red bars, which he held with a peculiar grace between finger and thumb, and in the cage was a beautiful green parrot. 32. The Fannings. They lived in a fine square house with a veranda all round it, on the top of a low hill that faced the river, and below them, a little to the right, was another fine square house which was the customs, and to this, for he was deputy commissioner, Fanning went every day. The city was 5 miles away, and on the river bank was nothing but a small village which had sprung up to provide the crews of junks with what gear or food they needed. In the city were a few missionaries, but these they saw seldom, and the only foreigners in the village besides themselves were the tide waiters. One of these had been an able seaman, and the other was an Italian. They both had Chinese wives. The Fannings asked them to tiffin on Christmas Day and on the King's birthday, but otherwise their relations with them were purely official. The steamers stayed but half an hour, so they never saw the captains or the chief engineers, who were the only white men on them, and for 5 months in the year the water was too low for steamers to pass. Oddly enough, it was then they saw most foreigners, for it happened now and again that a traveller, a merchant or consular official perhaps, more often a missionary, going upstream by junk, tied up for the night, and then the commissioner went down to the river and asked him to dine. They lived very much alone. Fanning was extremely bald, a short, thick-set man with a snub nose and a very black moustache. He was a martinet, aggressive, brusque, with a bullying manner, and he never spoke to a Chinese without raising his voice to a tone of rasping command. Though he spoke fluent Chinese, when one of his boys did something to displease him, he abused him roundly in English. He made a disagreeable impression on you till you discovered that his aggressiveness was merely an armor put on to conceal a painful shyness. It was a triumph of his will over his disposition. His gruffness was an almost absurd attempt to persuade those with whom he came in contact that he was not frightened of them. You felt that no one was more surprised than himself that he was taken seriously. He was like those little grotesque figures that children blow out like balloons, and you had an idea that he went in lively fear of bursting, and then everyone would see that he was but a hollow bladder. It was his wife who was constantly alert to persuade him that he was a man of iron, and when the explosion was over, she would say to him, "You know, you frighten me when you get in those passions," or I think I'd better say something to the boy. He's quite shaken by what you said." Then Fanning would puff himself up and smile indulgently. When a visitor came, she would say, "The Chinese are terrified of my husband, but of course they respect him. They know it's no good trying any of their nonsense with him." "Well, I ought to know how to treat them," he would answer with beetling brows. "I've been over 20 years in the country." Mrs. Fanning was a little plain woman, wizened like a crab-apple with a big nose and bad teeth. She was always very untidy. Her hair, going a little grey, was continually on the point of falling down. Now and then, in the midst of conversation, she would abstractedly take out a pin or two, give it a shake, and without troubling to look in the glass, insecurely fix its few thin wisps. She had a love of brilliant colour, and she wore fantastic clothes, which she and the sewing armour ran up together from the fashion papers. But when she dressed, she could never find anything that went with anything else, and she looked like a woman who had been rescued from shipwreck and clothed in any oddments that could be found. She was a caricature, and you could not help smiling when you looked at her. The only attractive thing she had was a soft and extremely musical voice, and she spoke with a little drawl which came from I know not what part of England. The Fannings had 2 sons, one of 9 and one of 7, and they completed the solitary household. They were attractive children, affectionate and demonstrative, and it was pleasant to see how united the family was. They had little jokes together that amused them hugely, and they played pranks with one another as though not one of them was more than 10. Though they had so much of one another's society, it really looked as though they could not bear to be out of one another's sight. And each day, when Fanning went to his office, his boys would hardly let him go. And each day when he returned, they greeted him with extravagant delight. They had no fear of his gruff bluster. And presently you discovered that the centre of this concord was that little, grotesque, ugly woman. It was not chance that kept the family united, nor peculiarly agreeable dispositions, but a passion of love in her. From the moment she got up in the morning till the time she went to bed, her thoughts were occupied with the welfare of the 3 male persons who were in her charge. Her active mind was busy all the time with schemes for their happiness. I do not think a thought of self ever entered her untidy head. She was a miracle of unselfishness. It was really hardly human. She never had a hard word for anyone. She was very hospitable, and it was she who caused her husband to go down to the houseboats and invite travellers to come up to dinner. But I do not think she wanted them for her own sake. She was quite happy in her solitude, but she thought her husband enjoyed a talk with strangers. "I don't want him to get in a rut," she said. "My poor husband, he misses his billiards and his bridge. It's very hard for a man to have no one to talk to but a woman." Every evening when the children had been put to bed, they played piquet. She had no head for cards, poor dear, and she always made mistakes, but when her husband upbraided her, she said, "You can't expect everyone to be as clever as you are." And because she so obviously meant what she said, he could not find it in his heart to be angry with her. Then, when the commissioner was tired of beating her, they would turn on the gramophone and, sitting side by side, listen in silence to the latest songs from the musical comedies of London. You may turn up your nose. They lived 10,000 miles away from England, and it was their only tie with the home they loved. It made them feel not quite so utterly cut off from civilization. And presently they would talk of what they would do with the children when they grew up. Soon it would be time to send them home to school, and perhaps a pang passed through the little woman's gentle heart. "It'll be hard for you, Bertie, when they go," she said. "But perhaps we shall be moved then to some place where there's a club, and then you'll be able to go and play bridge in the evenings." 33. The Song of the River. You hear it all along the river. You hear it loud and strong from the rowers as they urge the junk with its high stern, the mast lashed alongside, down the swift-running stream. You hear it from the trackers, a more breathless chaunt, as they pull desperately against the current. Half a dozen of them, perhaps, if they are taking up a whoopan, a couple of hundred if they are hauling a splendid junk, its square sail set over a rapid. On the junk, a man stands amidships, beating a drum incessantly to guide their efforts, and they pull with all their strength like men possessed, bent double. And sometimes, in the extremity of their travail, they crawl on the ground, on all fours, like the beasts of the field. They strain fiercely against the pitiless might of the stream. The leader goes up and down the line, and when he sees one who is not putting all his will into the task, he brings down his split bamboo on the naked back. Each one must do his utmost, or the labor of all is vain. And still they sing a vehement, eager chaunt, the chaunt of the turbulent waters. I do not know how words can describe what there is in it of effort. It serves to express the straining heart, the breaking muscles, and at the same time the indomitable spirit of man which overcomes the pitiless force of nature. Though the rope may part and the great junk swing back, in the end the rapid will be past. And at the close of the weary day there is the hearty meal and perhaps the opium pipe with its dreams of ease. But the most agonizing song is the song of the coolies, who bring the great bales from the junk up the steep steps to the town wall. Up and down they go, endlessly and endless as their toil rises, their rhythmic cry. Oh, they are barefoot and naked to the waist. The sweat pours down their faces, and their song is a groan of pain. It is a sigh of despair. It is heart-rending. It is hardly human. It is the cry of souls in infinite distress, only just musical, and that last note is the ultimate sob of humanity. Life is too hard, too cruel, and this is the final despairing protest. That is the song of the river. 34. Mirage. He is a tall man with bulging sky-blue eyes and an embarrassed manner. He looks as though he were a little too large for his skin, and you feel that he would be more comfortable if it were a trifle looser. His hair, very smooth and crisp, fits so tightly on his head that it gives you the impression of a wig, and you have an almost irresistible inclination to pull it. He has no small talk. He hunts for topics of conversation, and racking his brain to no purpose, in desperation offers you a whiskey and soda. He is in charge of the Beat, and the building in which he lives is office, godown, and residence all in one. His parlour is furnished with a suite of dingy upholstered furniture placed neatly round the walls, and in the middle is a round table. A hanging petroleum lamp gives a melancholy light and an oil stove heat. In appropriate places are richly framed oleographs from the Christmas numbers of American magazines. But he does not sit in this room. He spends his leisure in his bedroom. In America, he has always lived in a boarding house where his bedroom was the only privacy he knew, and he has gotten the habit of living in one. It seems unnatural to him to sit in a sitting room. He does not like to take his coat off, and he only feels at home in shirt sleeves. He keeps his books and his private papers in his bedroom. He has a desk and a rocking chair there. He has lived in China for 5 years, but he knows no Chinese and takes no interest in the race among whom, in all likelihood, the best years of his life will be spent. His business is done through an interpreter, and his house is managed by a boy. Now and then he takes a journey of several hundred miles into Mongolia, a wild and rugged country, either in Chinese carts or on ponies. And he sleeps at the wayside inns where congregate merchants, drovers, herdsmen, men-at-arms, ruffians, and wild fellows. The people of the land are turbulent. When there is unrest, he is exposed to not a little risk. But these are purely business undertakings. They bore him. He is always glad to get back to his familiar bedroom at the Beat, for he is a great reader. He reads nothing but American magazines, and the number of those he has sent to him by every mail is amazing. He never throws them away, and there are piles of them all over the house. The city in which he lives is the gateway into China from Mongolia. There dwell the teeming Chinese, and through its gates pass constantly the Mongols with their caravans of camels, endless processions of carts drawn by oxen, which have brought hides from the illimitable distances of Asia, rumble noisily through its crowded streets. He is bored. It has never occurred to him that he lives a life in which the possibility of adventure is at his doors. He can only recognize it through the printed page, and it needs a story of daring do in Texas or Nevada, of hairbreadth escape in the South Seas, to stir his blood. 35. The Stranger. It was a comfort in that sweltering heat to get out of the city. The missionary stepped out of the launch in which he had dropped leisurely down the river and comfortably settled himself in the chair which was waiting for him at the water's edge. He was carried through the village by the riverside and began to ascend the hill. It was an hour's journey along a pathway of broad stone steps under fir trees, and now and again you caught a delightful glimpse of the broad river shining in the sun amid the exultant green of the paddy fields. The bearers went along with a swinging stride. The sweat on their backs shone. It was a sacred mountain, with a Buddhist monastery on the top of it, and on the way up there were rest houses where the coolies set down the chair for a few minutes, and a monk in his grey robe gave you a cup of flowered tea. The air was fresh and sweet. The pleasure of that lazy journey, the swing of the chair was very soothing, made a day in the city almost worthwhile, and at the end of it was his trim little bungalow where he spent the summer, and before him the sweet-scented night. The mail had come in that day, and he was bringing on letters and papers. There were 4 numbers of the Saturday Evening Post and 4 of the Literary Digest. He had nothing but pleasant things to look forward to, and the usual peace, a peace, as he often said, which passeth all understanding, which filled him whenever he was among these green trees, away from the teeming city, should long since have descended upon him. But he was harassed. He had had that day an unfortunate encounter, and he was unable, trivial as it was, to put it out of his mind. It was on this account that his face bore a somewhat peevish expression. It was a thin and sensitive face, almost ascetic, with regular features and intelligent eyes. He was very long and thin, with the spindly legs of a grasshopper, and as he sat in his chair swaying a little with the motion of his bearers, he reminded you, somewhat grotesquely, of a faded lily, a gentle creature. He could never have hurt a fly. He had run across Dr. Saunders in one of the streets of the city. Dr. Saunders was a little grey-haired man with a high colour and a snub nose, which gave him a strangely impudent expression. He had a large, sensual mouth, and when he laughed, which he did very often, he showed decayed and discoloured teeth. When he laughed, his little blue eyes wrinkled in a curious fashion, and then he looked the very picture of malice. There was something fawn-like in him. His movements were quick and unexpected. He walked with a rapid trip, as though he were always in a hurry. He was a doctor who lived in the heart of the city among the Chinese. He was not on the register, but someone had made it his business to find out that he had been duly qualified. He had been struck off, but for what crime, whether social or purely professional, none know, nor how he had happened to come to the East and eventually settle on the China coast. But it was evident that he was a very clever doctor, and the Chinese had great faith in him. He avoided the foreigners, and rather disagreeable stories were circulated about him. Everyone knew him to say how do you do to, but no one asked him to his house, nor visited him in his own. When they had met that afternoon, Dr. Saunders had exclaimed, "What on earth has brought you to the city at this time of year?" I have some business that I couldn't leave any longer, answered the missionary. And then I wanted to get the mail. There was a stranger here the other day asking for you, said the doctor. For me? Cried the other with surprise. Well, not for you particularly, explained the doctor. He wanted to know the way to the American mission. I told him, but I said he wouldn't find anyone there. He seemed rather surprised at that, so I told him that you all went up to the hills in May and didn't come back till September. A foreigner? Asked the missionary, still wondering who the stranger could be. Oh yes, certainly. The doctor's eyes twinkled. Then he asked me about the other missions. I told him the London mission had a settlement here, but it wasn't the least use going there as all the missionaries were away in the hills. After all, it's devilish hot in the city. Then I'd like to go to one of the mission schools, said the stranger. Oh, they're all closed, I said. Well, then I'll go to the hospital. That's well worth a visit, I said. The American hospital is equipped with all the latest contrivances. Their operating theatre is perfect. What is the name of the doctor in charge? Oh, he's up in the hills. But what about the sick? There are no sick between May and September, I said, and if there are, they have to put up with the native dispensers. Dr. Saunders paused for a moment. The missionary looked ever so slightly vexed. Well, he said. The stranger looked at me irresolutely for a moment or two. I wanted to see something of the missions before I left, he said. You might try the Roman Catholics, I said. They're here all the year round. When do they take their holidays, then? He asked. They don't, I said. He left me at that. I think he went to the Spanish convent. The missionary fell into the trap, and it irritated him to think how ingenuously he had done so. He ought to have seen what was coming. Who was this anyway? He asked innocently. I asked him his name, said the doctor. Oh, I'm Christ, he said. The missionary shrugged his shoulders and abruptly told his rickshaw boy to go on. It had put him thoroughly out of temper. It was so unjust. Of course, they went away from May to September. The heat made any useful activity quite out of the question, and it had been found by experience that the missionaries preserved their health and strength much better if they spent the hot months in the hills. A sick missionary was only an encumbrance. It was a matter of practical politics, and it had been found that the Lord's work was done more efficiently if a certain part of the year was set aside for rest and recreation. And then the reference to the Roman Catholics was grossly unfair. They were unmarried. They had no families to think of. The mortality among them was terrifying. Why, in that very city of 14 nuns who had come out to China 10 years ago, all but 3 were dead. It was perfectly easy for them, because it was more convenient for their work, to live in the middle of the city and to stay there all the year round. They had no ties. They had no duties to those who were near and dear to them. Oh, it was grossly unjust to drag in the Roman Catholics. But suddenly, an idea flashed through his mind. What rankled most was that he had left the rascally doctor. You only had to look at his face all puckered with malicious amusement to know he was a rogue, without a word. There certainly was an answer, but he had not had the presence of mind to make it, and now the perfect repartee occurred to him. A glow of satisfaction filled him, and he almost fancied that he had made it. It was a crushing rejoinder, and he rubbed his very long, thin hands with satisfaction. My dear sir, he ought to have said, our Lord never in the whole course of his ministry claimed to be the Christ. It was an unanswerable snub, and thinking of it, the missionary forgot his ill humor. 36. Democracy. It was a cold night. I had finished my dinner, and my boy was making up my bed while I sat over a brazier of burning charcoal. Most of the coolies had already settled themselves for the night in a room next to mine, and through the thin matchboarding of the wall that separated us, I heard a couple of them talk. Another party of travellers had arrived about an hour before, and the small inn was full. Suddenly there was a commotion, and going to the door of my room to look out, I saw 3 sedan chairs enter the courtyard. They were set down in front of me, and from the first stepped out a stout Chinese of imposing aspect. He wore a long black robe of figured silk lined with squirrel, and on his head a square fur cap. He seemed taken aback when he saw me at the door of the principal guest chamber, and turning to the landlord, addressed him in authoritative tones. It appeared that he was an official, and he was much annoyed to find that the best apartment in the inn was already taken. He was told that but one room was available. It was small, with pallets covered with tumbled straw lining the walls, and was used as a rule only by coolies. He flung into a violent passion, and on a sudden arose a scene of the greatest animation. The official, his 2 companions, and his bearers exclaimed against the indignity which it was sought to thrust upon him, while the landlord and the servants of the inn argued, expostulated, and entreated. The officials stormed and threatened. For a few minutes the courtyard, so silent before, rang with the angry shouts. Then, subsiding as quickly as it began, the hubbub ceased, and the official went into the vacant room. Hot water was brought by a bedraggled servant, and presently the landlord followed with great bowls of steaming rice. All was once more quiet. An hour later, I went into the yard to stretch my legs for 5 minutes before going to bed, and somewhat to my surprise, I came upon the stout official, a little while ago so pompous and self-important, seated at a table in the front of the inn with the most ragged of my coolies. They were chatting amicably, and the official quietly smoked a water pipe. He had made all that to do to give himself face, but having achieved his object was satisfied, and feeling the need of conversation had accepted the company of any coolie without a thought of social distinction. His manner was perfectly cordial, and there was in it no trace of condescension. The coolie talked with him on an equal footing. It seemed to me that this was true democracy. In the East, man is man's equal in a sense you find neither in Europe nor in America. Position and wealth put a man in a relation of superiority to another that is purely adventitious, and they are no bar to sociability. When I lay in my bed, I asked myself why in the despotic East there should be between men an equality so much greater than in the free and democratic West, and was forced to the conclusion that the explanation must be sought in the cesspool. For in the West we are divided from our fellows by our sense of smell. The working man is our master, inclined to rule us with an iron hand, but it cannot be denied that he stinks. None can wonder at it, for a bath in the dawn when you have to hurry to your work before the factory bell rings is no pleasant thing, nor does heavy labor tend to sweetness. And you do not change your linen more than you can help when the week's washing must be done by a sharp-tongued wife. I do not blame the working man because he stinks, but stink he does. It makes social intercourse difficult to persons of a sensitive nostril. The matutinal tub divides the classes more effectually than birth, wealth, or education. It is very significant that those novelists who have risen from the ranks of labor are apt to make it a symbol of class prejudice, and one of the most distinguished writers of our day always marks the rascals of his entertaining stories by the fact that they take a bath every morning. Now, the Chinese live all their lives in the proximity of very nasty smells. They do not notice them. Their nostrils are blunted to the odors that assail the Europeans, and so they can move on an equal footing with the tiller of the soil, the coolie, and the artisan. I venture to think that the cesspool is more necessary to democracy than parliamentary institutions. The invention of the sanitary convenience has destroyed the sense of equality in men. It is responsible for class hatred much more than the monopoly of capital in the hands of the few. It is a tragic thought that the first man who pulled the plug of a water closet with that negligent gesture rang the knell of democracy. 37. the Seventh-day Adventist. He was a big man, and his bones were well covered. He gave you the impression that he had put on flesh since he bought his clothes, for they seemed somewhat tight for him. He always wore the same things, a blue suit, evidently bought ready-made in a department store, the lapel decorated with a small American flag, a high starched collar, and a white tie, on which was a pattern of forget-me-nots. His short nose and pugnacious chin gave his clean-shaven face a determined look. His eyes, behind large gold-rimmed spectacles, were large and blue, and his hair, receding on the temples, lank and dull, was plastered down on his head. But on the crown protruded a rebellious cock's feather. He was traveling up the Yangtze for the first time, but he took no interest in his surroundings. He had no eye for the waste of turbulent waters that was spread before him, nor for the colors, tragic or tender, which sunrise and sunset lent the scene. The great junks with their square white sails proceeded stately down the stream. The moon rose, flooding the noble river with silver and giving a strange magic to the temples on the bank, among a grove of trees. He was frankly bored. During a certain part of the day he studied Chinese, but for the rest of the time he read nothing but a New York Times 3 months old and the parliamentary debates of July 1915, which, heaven knows why, happened to be on board. He took no interest in the religions which flourished in the land he had come to evangelize. He classed them all contemptuously as devil worship. I do not think he had ever read the Analects of Confucius. He was ignorant of the history, art, and literature of China. I could not make out what had brought him to the country. He spoke of his work as a profession which he had entered as a man might enter the civil service, and which, though it was poorly paid, he complained that he earned less than an artisan. He wanted notwithstanding to make a good job of. He wanted to increase his church membership. He wanted to make his school self-supporting. If ever he had had a serious call to convert the heathen, there was in him no trace of it now. He looked upon the whole matter as a business proposition. The secret of success lay in the precious word organization. He was upright, honest, and virtuous, but there was neither passion in him nor enthusiasm. He seemed to be under the impression that the Chinese were very simple people, and because they did not know the same things that he did, he thought them ignorant. He could not help showing that he looked upon himself as superior to them. The laws they made were not applicable to the white man, and he resented the fact that they expected him to conform to their customs. But he was not a bad fellow. Indeed, he was a good-humored one, and so long as you did not attempt to question his authority, there is no doubt that he would have done everything in his power to serve you. 38. The Philosopher. It was surprising to find so vast a city in a spot that seemed to me so remote. From its battlemented gate towards sunset, you could see the snowy mountains of Tibet. It was so populous that you could walk at ease only on the walls, and it took a rapid walker 3 hours to complete their circuit. There was no railway within 1,000 miles, and the river on which it stood was so shallow that only junks of light burden could safely navigate it. 5 days in a sampan were needed to reach the upper Yangtze. For an uneasy moment, you asked yourself whether trains and steamships were as necessary to the conduct of life as we who use them every day consider. For here, 1 million persons throve, married, begat their kind, and died. Here, 1 million persons were busily occupied with commerce, art, and thought. And here lived a philosopher of repute, the desire to see whom had been to me one of the incentives of a somewhat arduous journey. He was the greatest authority in China on the Confucian learning. He was said to speak English and German with facility. He had been for many years secretary to one of the Empress Dowager's greatest viceroys, but he lived now in retirement. On certain days in the week, however, all through the year he opened his doors to such as sought after knowledge and discoursed on the teaching of Confucius. He had a body of disciples, but it was small, since the students, for the most part, preferred to his modest dwelling and his severe exhortations the sumptuous buildings of the foreign university and the useful science of the barbarians. With him, this was mentioned only to be scornfully dismissed. From all I heard of him, I concluded that he was a man of character. When I announced my wish to meet this distinguished person, my host immediately offered to arrange a meeting. But the days passed, and nothing happened. I made inquiries, and my host shrugged his shoulders. "I sent him a chit and told him to come along," he said. "I don't know why he hasn't turned up. He's a cross-grained old fellow." I did not think it was proper to approach a philosopher in so cavalier a fashion, and I was hardly surprised that he had ignored a summons such as this. I caused a letter to be sent asking, in the politest terms I could devise, whether he would allow me to call upon him, and within 2 hours received an answer, making an appointment for the following morning at 10 o'clock. I was carried in a chair. The way seemed interminable. I went through crowded streets and through streets deserted, till I came at last to one, silent and empty, in which at a small door in a long white wall my bearers set down my chair. One of them knocked, and after a considerable time a Judas was opened. Dark eyes looked through, there was a brief colloquy, and finally I was admitted. A youth, pallid of face, wizened and poorly dressed, motioned me to follow him. I did not know if he was a servant or a pupil of the great man. I passed through a shabby yard and was led into a long, low room, sparsely furnished, with an American roll-top desk, a couple of blackwood chairs and 2 little Chinese tables. Against the walls were shelves on which were a great number of books. Most of them, of course, were Chinese, but there were many philosophical and scientific works in English, French, and German, and there were hundreds of unbound copies of learned reviews. Where books did not take up the wall space, hung scrolls on which in various calligraphies were written, I suppose, Confucian quotations. There was no carpet on the floor. It was a cold, bare, and comfortless chamber. Its somberness was relieved only by a yellow chrysanthemum, which stood by itself on the desk in a long vase. I waited for some time, and the youth who had shown me in brought a pot of tea, 2 cups, and a tin of Virginian cigarettes. As he went out, the philosopher entered. I hastened to express my sense of the honor he did me in allowing me to visit him. He waved me to a chair and poured out the tea. "I am flattered that you wish to see me," he returned. "Your countrymen deal only with coolies and with compradors. They think every Chinese must be one or the other." I ventured to protest, but I had not caught his point. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression of mockery. "They think they have but to beckon, and we must come." I saw then that my friend's unfortunate communication still rankled. I did not quite know how to reply. I murmured something complimentary. He was an old man, tall, with a thin grey queue and bright large eyes under which were heavy bags. His teeth were broken and discolored. He was exceedingly thin, and his hands, fine and small, were withered and claw-like. I had been told that he was an opium smoker. He was very shabbily dressed in a black gown, a little black cap, both much the worse for wear, and dark grey trousers gartered at the ankle. He was watching. He did not quite know what attitude to take up, and he had the manner of a man who was on his guard. Of course, the philosopher occupies a royal place among those who concern themselves with the things of the spirit, and we have the authority of Benjamin Disraeli that royalty must be treated with abundant flattery. I seized my trowel. Presently, I was conscious of a certain relaxation in his demeanor. He was like a man who was all set and rigid to have his photograph taken, but hearing the shutter click, lets himself go and eases into his natural self. He showed me his books. "I took the PhD in Berlin, you know," he said, "and afterwards I studied for some time in Oxford. But the English, if you will allow me to say so, have no great aptitude for philosophy." Though he put the remark apologetically, it was evident that he was not displeased to say a slightly disagreeable thing. "We have had philosophers who have not been without influence in the world of thought," I suggested. "Hume and Berkeley, the philosophers who taught at Oxford when I was there, were anxious not to offend their theological colleagues. They would not follow their thought to its logical consequences in case they should jeopardize their position in university society." "Have you studied the modern developments of philosophy in America?" I asked. "Are you speaking of pragmatism? It is the last refuge of those who want to believe the incredible. I have more use for American petroleum than for American philosophy." His judgments were tart. We sat down once more and drank another cup of tea. He began to talk with fluency. He spoke a somewhat formal but an idiomatic English. Now and then he helped himself out with a German phrase. So far as it was possible for a man of that stubborn character to be influenced, he had been influenced by Germany. The method and the industry of the Germans had deeply impressed him, and their philosophical acumen was patent to him when a laborious professor published in a learned magazine an essay on one of his own writings. "I have written 20 books," he said, "and that is the only notice that has ever been taken of me in a European publication." But his study of Western philosophy had only served in the end to satisfy him that wisdom, after all, was to be found within the limits of the Confucian canon. He accepted its philosophy with conviction. It answered the needs of his spirit with a completeness which made all foreign learning seem vain. I was interested in this because it bore out an opinion of mine that philosophy is an affair of character rather than of logic. The philosopher believes not according to evidence, but according to his own temperament, and his thinking merely serves to make reasonable what his instinct regards as true. If Confucianism gained so firm a hold on the Chinese, it is because it explained and expressed them as no other system of thought could do. My host lit a cigarette. His voice at first had been thin and tired, but as he grew interested in what he said, it gained volume. He talked vehemently. There was in him none of the repose of the sage. He was a polemist and a fighter. He loathed the modern cry for individualism. For him, society was the unit, and the family the foundation of society. He upheld the old China and the old school, monarchy, and the rigid canon of Confucius. He grew violent and bitter as he spoke of the students, fresh from foreign universities, who with sacrilegious hands tore down the oldest civilization in the world. "But you, do you know what you're doing?" he exclaimed. "What is the reason for which you deem yourselves our betters? Have you excelled us in arts or letters? Have our thinkers been less profound than yours? Has our civilization been less elaborate, less complicated, less refined than yours? Why, when you lived in caves and clothed yourselves with skins, we were a cultured people. Do you know that we tried an experiment which is unique in the history of the world? We sought to rule this great country not by force, but by wisdom, and for centuries we succeeded. Then why does the white man despise the yellow? Shall I tell you? Because he has invented the machine gun. That is your superiority. We are a defenseless horde, and you can blow us into eternity. You have shattered the dream of our philosophers that the world could be governed by the power of law and order. And now you are teaching our young men your secret. You have thrust your hideous inventions upon us. Do you not know that we have a genius for mechanics? Do you not know that there are in this country 400 millions of the most practical and industrious people in the world? Do you think it will take us long to learn? And what will become of your superiority when the yellow man can make as good guns as the white and fire them as straight? You have appealed to the machine gun, and by the machine gun shall you be judged." But at that moment we were interrupted. A little girl came softly in and nestled close up to the old gentleman. She stared at me with curious eyes. He told me that she was his youngest child. He put his arms round her and with a murmur of caressing words kissed her fondly. She wore a black coat and trousers that barely reached her ankles, and she had a long pigtail hanging down her back. She was born on the day the revolution was brought to a successful issue by the abdication of the emperor. I thought she heralded the spring of a new era, he said. She was but the last flower of this great nation's fall. From a drawer in his roll-top desk, he took a few cash and, handing them to her, sent her away. "You see that I wear a queue," he said, taking it in his hands. "It is a symbol. I am the last representative of the old China." He talked to me, more gently now, of how philosophers in long past days wandered from state to state with their disciples, teaching all who were worthy to learn. Kings called them to their councils and made them rulers of cities. His erudition was great, and his eloquent phrases gave a multicolored vitality to the incidents he related to me of the history of his country. I could not help thinking him a somewhat pathetic figure. He felt in himself the capacity to administer the state, but there was no king to entrust him with office. He had vast stores of learning, which he was eager to impart to the great band of students that his soul hankered after, and there came to listen but a few wretched, half-starved and obtuse provincials. Once or twice discretion had made me suggest that I should take my leave, but he had been unwilling to let me go. Now at last I was obliged to. I rose. He held my hand. "I should like to give you something as a recollection of your visit to the last philosopher in China, but I am a poor man, and I do not know what I can give you that would be worthy of your acceptance." I protested that the recollection of my visit was in itself a priceless gift. He smiled. "Men have short memories in these degenerate days, and I should like to give you something more substantial. I would give you one of my books, but you cannot read Chinese." He looked at me with an amicable perplexity. I had an inspiration. "Give me a sample of your calligraphy," I said. "Would you like that?" He smiled. In my youth, I was considered to wield the brush in a manner that was not entirely despicable. He sat down at his desk, took a fair sheet of paper, and placed it before him. He poured a few drops of water on a stone, rubbed the ink stick in it, and took his brush. With a free movement of the arm, he began to write. And as I watched him, I remembered with not a little amusement something else which had been told me of him. It appeared that the old gentleman, whenever he could scrape a little money together, spent it wantonly in the streets inhabited by ladies, to describe whom a euphemism is generally used. His eldest son, a person of standing in the city, was vexed and humiliated by the scandal of this behavior, and only his strong sense of filial duty prevented him from reproaching the libertine with severity. I dare say that to a son such looseness would be disconcerting, but the student of human nature could look upon it with equanimity. Philosophers are apt to elaborate their theories in the study, forming conclusions upon life which they know only at second hand, and it has seemed to me often that their works would have a more definite significance if they had exposed themselves to the vicissitudes which befall the common run of men. I was prepared to regard the old gentleman's dalliance in hidden places with leniency. Perhaps he sought but to elucidate the most inscrutable of human illusions. He finished. To dry the ink, he scattered a little ash on the paper and, rising, handed it to me. "What have you written?" I asked. I thought there was a slightly malicious gleam in his eyes. "I have ventured to offer you 2 little poems of my own." "I did not know you were a poet." "When China was still an uncivilized country," he retorted with sarcasm, All educated men could write verse at least with elegance. I took the paper and looked at the Chinese characters. They made an agreeable pattern upon it. Won't you also give me a translation? Traduttore, traditore, he answered. You cannot expect me to betray myself. Ask one of your English friends. Those who know most about China know nothing, but you will at least find one who is competent to give you a rendering of a few rough and simple lines. I bade him farewell, and with great politeness he showed me to my chair. When I had the opportunity, I gave the poems to a sinologue of my acquaintance, and here is the version he made. I confess that, doubtless unreasonably, I was somewhat taken aback when I read it. You loved me not. Your voice was sweet. Your eyes were full of laughter. Your hands were tender. And then you loved me. Your voice was bitter. Your eyes were full of tears. Your hands were cruel. Sad, sad that love should make you unlovable. I craved the years would quickly pass, that you might lose the brightness of your eyes, the peach bloom of your skin, and all the cruel splendor of your youth. Then I alone would love you, and you at last would care. The envious years have passed full soon, and you have lost the brightness of your eyes, the peach bloom of your skin, and all the charming splendor of your youth. Alas, I do not love you, and I care not if you care. I owe it to the kindness of my friend Mr. P.W. Davidson.